So this is the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, Book 1, Sutra 9, which I've titled Delusion or Fancy. And this is a comparative study course by myself, Dr. Lisa Love, using 3 books by B.K.S Iyengar, Swami Satchidananda, and Alice Bailey, all speaking on the Yoga Sutras. So here we have Book 1, Sutra 9. And the first interpretation of the Sanskrit is by Swami Satchidananda, and he says, an image that arises on hearing mere words without any reality as its basis is verbal delusion. B.K.S Iyengar interprets it as verbal knowledge devoid of substance is fancy or imagination. And Alice Bailey interprets the Sanskrit for the sutra as saying, fancy rests upon images which have no real existence. And as usual, it's really interesting to notice how different some of the interpretations of the Sanskrit can be, but we can see the similarities there. So, for the record, it is fun to quickly compare the translations by Swami Satchidananda and Alice Bailey of the Sanskrit here, because Swami Satchidananda uses a more accurate rendition of the Sanskrit. So the words verbal delusion is closer to the true translation than the word fancy. Still, if you think of something as fanciful, that means in essence it is delusional. Also, Bailey continues to invite us to understand that the mind we use may be perceiving things differently depending upon our mental training and our self-realization. And we've been showing a model whereby Bailey breaks up the mind into the kama-manasic mind, which is more emotional mind, kama-emotional manasic mind, and the lower concrete mind, which is more the fact-driven mind, and the abstract mind. And then she also uses the Buddhic mind, which is found in the usage by Swami Satchidananda and B.K.S Iyengar as well. So the word fanciful or verbal delusion or fancy has to do with a certain level of mind that we're looking through, and Alice Bailey makes that distinction. And as we keep going in this video, you'll see that that level of mind is primarily the kama-manasic or emotional mind. She says direct cognition through the senses is typically not subjected to the reasoning powers of the mind. So she's making a distinction between what we see out there and maybe perceive as facts, the lower concrete mind, and our ability to really understand the inner meaning of what it is we're seeing, which is more abstract mind and even at the Buddhic plane. Because we're not able to truly ascertain or discern what we're seeing through what level of mind, it can often move into fanciful or delusional ways of thinking and perceiving. So in order to work with fancy, we really have to understand that we're A, in it, and B, that we are not perceiving through the right level of mind. So learning to question one's thoughts, assumptions, and perceptions is extremely valuable and leads to the increased development of the direct cognition of the yogi. It's really important, the more you remember who you are as the peaceful self or the self, the more you begin to ask yourself, am I really seeing things clearly? And you begin to question those assumptions. You begin to question the so-called facts at hand. You begin to wonder what level of mind or even emotion you're operating through. And by doing that, you achieve direct cognition of the yogi, as it's called. Now, this kind of training is found in a lot of places. For example, I live in Ojai, where Byron Katie lives, and a lot of her method of the work is a training along this way. Krishnamurti also lived here in Ojai, and he did a lot to help people question their assumptions and their conditioning. There's The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. That's a popular book, and he does some of this. There are many different ways and methods of doing this that you can find, but the key is to get increasingly rigorous about doing it. You can find that in Christian mysticism. You can find that in Buddhism. You can find that probably in any rigorous tradition. And in fact, speaking of Buddhism, it's interesting to note that especially in Tibetan Buddhism, this rigorous training of the mind happens constantly, especially through the rigorous methods of debate. And I've seen those debates live through members of the Gadan Shartsi Monastery. And what impressed me most is that any spiritual seeker must be willing to have one's thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions rigorously challenged and tested. Now, that is part of Raja Yoga, which the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali is really all about. It's about integrating yoga at many different levels, all the way back to the introduction of this series, that introductory video. You can find it, if you'd like, through my website, or if you're taking this course with me, it's being delivered to you, or temporarily these videos are out for free on YouTube. If they still are, you can find it there. But what's most important is that we begin to understand that yoga involves rigorous mental training. This is, ironically, is something rarely seen in the so-called educated West, except in more scientific circles, and often it doesn't even happen there. Too much scientism is simply looking at the facts and assuming that everything is correct, getting locked in their own boxes of their own scientific dogma. So even though the scientific ideal involves constantly questioning one's thoughts, assumptions, and perceptions, a lot of it becomes scientism, where it's just as dogmatic as a religious system can be, or an atheistic system can be. Any system of thought can become locked in a box, conditioned, dogmatic, and closed, where we're no longer questioning, we're no longer challenging, we're no longer open. But in Raja Yoga, in any spiritual tradition that is working at this level, we are challenging constantly, continually, our assumptions and beliefs. So verbal delusion or fancy can also be akin to the notion of myth that in our time Joseph Campbell refers to. He's a famous mythologist who is in the Santa Barbara, he's since passed away, in the Santa Barbara area near where I live, and I have studied him a lot. And also he inspired the Star Wars series. He was a friend of George Lucas. And Joseph Campbell let us know that myths are not things that are false or just fanciful. They are stories that we tell ourselves about reality, that in truth are not based upon reality. They're the stories we're telling. And it's really popular in psychology now to get people to question their stories, okay? To question the myths. Now, myths can have real meaning in that we need some sort of story about why we're going through what we're going through in our lives. It's just we need to keep questioning them, because when we don't, these myths are based upon distorted mental modifications, especially at the level of emotional desire or kama-manas, because they also involve a misrepresentation of the facts, the logical mind, and they can even involve a false understanding of the overall pattern of how our universe works at the abstract mind. So we're going to talk specifically in a moment in this video about fancy being related to primarily the emotional desire, kama-manas aspect of mind. But truly, any myth can affect all the levels until we get onto the Buddhic plane. So to see clearly, we must identify with the soul, the peaceful self, the Christ within, our Buddhic nature, the Buddhic plane, and use that light of the soul as a searchlight to illuminate the darkness so that we can better see the soul within all forms, and in that awareness better understand the right unfoldment of any form in existence. True Buddhic awareness understands the true purpose, intention, and meaning of whatever we see, and through love and compassion and sensitivity in the highest form, because it's not just an emotional sensitivity where we're freaked out by life because we're overly sensitive. It's a sensitivity to really seeing, knowing, and understanding how anything is attempting to play out and evolve in the overall dance or story of life. That's my commentation. Now let's look at the commentary by our three main authors. So again, Sri Swami Satchidananda interprets the sutra as an image that arises on hearing mere words without any reality. As its basis is verbal delusion. And so he refers to the problem of misconception as viparyaya and indicates it is based on some reality, though a mistaken one, while verbal delusion, vikalpa, is based essentially on nothing but opinions, which may have no basis in truth whatsoever. So you're getting a little bit of the distinction here. It's not just that we have a misconception. We think a snake is a rope or a rope is a snake. That was in the previous sutra where we looked at that on penetrating illusion. It's something even more. Verbal delusion means that we've just sunk into our opinions, which we see so much on our media. Just everybody's judgments and opinions flying around, you know, just moralistically condemning other people, getting stuck in your own viewpoint and your own truth without even considering the larger truth, the larger whole, which means that you may not have a basis in truth whatsoever in your opinion. You're not willing to look, question your assumptions at all. You're just stuck in your viewpoint. The story of the blind men and they're surrounding an elephant, and one says, oh, you know, basically describes the elephant as a trunk. One is a tail, one is legs, one is a body, and they're all right if they had a larger perspective. The more we lift out of verbal delusion, fancy, I'm also going to call it glamour in this video, the more we train our minds to get out of just the lower concrete mind, as Alice Bailey calls it, with its factual opinions, so-called fact, which are really just chemomonastic judgments. The more we get out of that and lift increasingly into the Buddhic plane, the more we see the whole elephant. The more all the parts go into a larger whole, a synthesis, so to speak. B.K.S Iyengar says, verbal knowledge devoid of substance is fancy or imagination. And here's a quote from him: playing with fanciful thoughts or words and living in one's own world of thoughts and impressions which have no substantial basis is a vikalpa. We get that same word. A vague and uncertain knowledge which does not correspond to reality. In such a state of delusion, one is like the hare in the fable who imagined it had horns. Now, sometimes this kind of fancy is really blatant. We meet people, or maybe ourselves, we have delusions of grandeur. We have grandiose ideas of what it is that we think we can accomplish, and then we just fall flat on our face. We have grandiose ideas of who we are, like a hare who has horns, and then we find out that that's just not true. Reality hits us in the face, and we discover that we're living in fancy. We're living in delusion. We're living in imagination without any real substance. Alice Bailey goes on to further explain this. She says, fancy rests upon images which have no real existence. That's a similar interpretation of what we just had from Iyengar. And for Bailey, fancy is like fanciful thinking, like that imagination that Iyengar is talking about. And she says often it's totally made up by people and fed by their wills. Their will makes them attached to their view, attached to their opinion. And they may not even have arrived at that opinion through their own experience, just because people say that, you know, this is what is so, and they attach to it. And they don't have an understanding at all that it's a delusion. Somebody told them that the world is flat. They don't understand that the world is round, and they'll just stick with the world is flat because that's their conditioning. That's what they were taught. They're not open to any other ideas. We see this kind of stuff go on constantly. It's probably going on within us as well. And that's what we need to take a look at, our own fancy delusion. And in a moment, we'll get into more details in Glamour. Because as it says here, in other books, Alice Bailey gives this word fancy the name of glamour. She even has a whole book called Glamour World Problem. These glamours are distortions of reality and are made up by, one, the individual, We have our own individual distortions. 2, various races, nations, or groups and organizations. We have our own distortions, our own myths of what is true out there. And 3, what she calls the dweller on the threshold, which is a name she uses in regards to the selfish aspects of the ego. Now, it's important to understand in her book, she uses the word ego quite differently. Ego is simply your individuality. Everybody has that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with having an ego. In popular psychology right now, people feel that ego is bad. That's not how Alice Bailey interprets it. She distinguishes between the ego and the personality, or what she calls the dweller on the threshold. That is the selfish part of our individuality that we need to look at. So these fancies or delusions can be, she says, either of a high or low nature. Some of them seem really true, and they're really hard to understand that they're just a delusion. And others are really low and easy for most people to understand that they're delusional. She also states that this sutra is of most profound significance, which is perhaps why she later wrote an entire book on it, again known as Glamour World Problem. Now, for Sri Swami Satchidananda, he says that Sutra 2 is the most important. In Alice Bailey, she says that this is the most important. Perhaps because so many of us are struggling with glamour or fancy or verbal delusion. So many of us are in it. Just turn on the television, listen to songs on the radio, look at some movies, and it's real easy to see how much we're steeped in these glamours as a human race. We're steeped in them. So Sutra 2 is basically that yoga is about overcoming the mental modifications. And so in a sense, that's a very important sutra because that's what yoga is all about. But for Alice Bailey, most of us are steeped in this level, and so this is the main area where we have to do our work. So let's take a little bit more of a closer look at glamour or fancy. Glamours are primarily emotional and reactive in nature. In the peaceful self process that I teach and that I use when I work with people, one of the key things is to understand when you're no longer in the center. You're no longer abiding within that peaceful self. You've forgotten who you are, to kind of review some of the sutras that we've already covered. And usually we can spot that when we're getting emotional and reactive. Everything's getting stirred up. We're getting into the drama, as people call it. And we're human. Unless we're extremely highly evolved, we're going to go there. And when we go there, it's important not to judge us or other people. It's just important to, first of all, recognize it, see it, name it. Ah, I'm really getting emotionally reactive here. That is a huge step. Just being able to name it is so essential because then you're going to be able to back yourself away from it and get yourself back to center, back to the peaceful self. Glamours also tend to separate and create division instead of unity. It's me against you. It's us against them. We're not using the mind to shift and slowly get up into those higher levels of Buddhic awareness where we have a synthesis, where we have unity. Bailey says a good sign that glamour is present is when there's criticism. So we're criticizing instead of attempting to understand. If we notice, I'm criticizing you because I have the right way and you have the wrong way, we're in a glamour at some level. We're stuck in the lower concrete mind with an emotional attachment. True, our perception may be more valid. It may be more inclusive and universal. But there's a way to share that with somebody or even share that about ourselves without criticism. We can understand that with compassion, with insight, with sensitivity, without criticism. Another sign that glamour is present is when there's a sense of superiority. I'm better than you. Or any kind of separation and pride are present in ourselves or others. These often come from an emotional nature that needs to protect and defend itself. And being able to understand that, why am I so attached here? Why do I have to think I'm right and they're wrong? Why am I so afraid of considering another point of view? Why do I not want to have an open mind? Usually it's based out of a fear. And that fear is that somehow or another we may discover we're wrong. And that's also based in pride and ego, in the popular way in which people use it, not in the way Alice Bailey uses it. She would say it's based in the dweller on the threshold. That's her word for the selfish nature. And we need to protect that. And again, through what I call the peaceful self process, the person learns to lift more into the mind and out of the emotional reactivity to more carefully analyze and weigh out the various perspectives and options involved. And then eventually we lift more into the Buddhic plane where there's greater insight, empathy, and compassion. Now that can be really hard when we're locked into some really difficult stuff where people, we really feel violated and wounded, and we got to sort all that out. You know, we can all get triggered by our emotions. And it's important not to say it's bad that we've gotten triggered by our emotions. It's important simply to recognize that we're there and lift ourselves out. So here's a way of sorting out what we've just talked about based upon our different levels of consciousness. And if you've been following along, this is really familiar to you. But we're going to refine it just a little bit. So the levels of self, or the selfless levels, we're not dealing with the Atmic plane in this series much at all. We're dealing primarily with the Buddhic plane, where we have insight, clear seeing, compassion, and empathy. We also have like right action, because we have clear knowledge. We're talking in the Yoga Sutras about the 5 different ways that the mind modifies itself. Clear knowledge, which we had a video on. Penetrating illusion, or illusion, which was the video prior to this. Fancy, which is this video. And sleep and memory, which are coming up. So when we're into the ego levels, and again, Bailey doesn't use that word ego in the same way that it's popularly used. She would call it the dweller. When we're into the dweller, we are mentally into being critical, judgmental, proud, and confused. We could also say moralistic. I'm right, you're wrong. And just as for the fun of it, listen to the radio, turn on the TV, watch some movies, and just start to notice how much criticism, judgment, pride is out there. Also, how much confusion is out there. Just start noticing it. Wonderful exercise. Next, emotionally, it comes out as reactive, defensive, insecure, and irrational. Completely crazy ways of fanciful ways of viewing things, delusional ways of viewing things, based usually on our insecurity or our lack of mental development, or a lot of wounding that we've had in our lives that have caused emotional triggers. Could even be due to certain brain issues that have happened with too much trauma, so that the brain itself isn't able to really function correctly. Dr. Amen, who has the wonderful book Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, has some wonderful insights of how all of this can get even more difficult to lift up to these higher levels, because the brain is getting traumatized. But we can change our brains and change our lives, and we do that by identifying with levels of consciousness which help us to see what's going on, and thereby see what we need to do to help change the brain, change the physical body, the physical world. In the physical realms, whether it's through the brain or in our overall physical body or in our overall physical environment, it starts to become depleted. We lack coordination. It's sluggish. We can't move through it effectively. We can't get things done. And you can see how, oh, God bless us, Goddess bless us, Spirit bless us. If we're in these lower realms, it's like we're in a soup that is full of toxic waste, so to speak, and we don't even know that we're in it. We're swimming amongst criticism, judgment, pride, confusion, emotional reactivity, defensiveness, insecurity, irrationality, fancy, delusion. We're becoming physically scarce in terms of our ability to use things correctly, depleted, devitalized, lacking coordination, lost. God bless us. Goddess bless us. Spirit bless us. We deserve so much compassion. for the soup that we're all swimming in. The way out, of course, is to build that rainbow bridge, that Antakarana, to help us get out of this soup and lift up into these higher realms. Now, I'm going to briefly go through some glamours that Bailey states in her book, Glamour, A World Problem. Now, she has way more listed than I have time to do in this video. It would take me hours to do this video. But I just want to start giving you a sense of different kinds of glamours. The easiest way to know you're in a glamour, again, is what we just explained, this pride, emotional reactivity, etc. But here are some types of glamours. The glamour of materiality, that we are only in the material world. I refer you to the books by Amit Goswami on quantum physics, to understand the new physics, the new science, and how it's basically putting a death blow to the glamours that we are only our brains and our bodies. We are consciousness. And this is based on a denial of the self, the peaceful self, the consciousness that we are. So to get out of the materialistic views of the world, which are even found in science, I remember when I was in my bachelor's degree, a long time ago, we were asked to read a book, The Selfish Gene. And I just read it and I went, boy, this book is so far off base. Of course, who am I to challenge it? Well, I'm not a scientist, but then there are scientists that are challenging it out there. And I've actually seen Deepak Chopra in a video encounter the author of the book, The Selfish Gene. And they have their view. But when you look at the new science and the new physics, their view comes into question and could be considered a glamour. The glamour of sentiment, where we become overly sentimental. That's like wanting to help somebody because we feel for them, we're sensitive, but we don't know how to do anything practical. It's based on a pseudo love, based on desire and need. In other words, it's not based on a sense of really mentally training ourselves to know how to help. So we have a desire and need to help, but we have no real love, because love involves a certain level of intelligence and will to love. We don't have that. It's really like a lazy kind of love. Devotion. Devotion can be wonderful. This is one of those glamours that can be a high glamour, difficult to really see, because it can cause fanaticism and an inability to see other points of view. We become devoted to our particular teacher or guru or spiritual path or way of seeing the world. Now that can be good in a certain way, devotion, in that it helps us to really have some persistence, some sticking in there to follow a path. But it can become a glamour when it falls into this kind of fanaticism. The glamour of power. Again, power can be a good thing in that we can use that power like a generator to move us along the spiritual path, to lift us up into the Buddhic plane, to have spiritual power. But it can also be wanting to come primarily from the solar plexus chakra, which is at the level of the stomach, which is where you just want to have power over others instead of empowering yourself and others. And you're more concerned with calling attention to yourself than with loving and understanding more deeply. A glamour of authority. Again, there's nothing wrong with trying to author your own life or to respecting certain authority figures. That is actually part of one of the Yoga Sutras we looked at on clear knowledge, but it's a glamour when we listen to authority simply based upon fear that allows for the emergence of oligarchies, which is where the rich and powerful take over. Some people say that the United States, when I'm doing this video, is now an oligarchy. So says a Princeton study. And a dictatorship. A dictatorship is where there's a few people saying what goes for everybody. An oligarchy is where it's the rich people only that are saying what goes for everybody. So we're taught to question authority. We don't have to lose our devotion to a trusted authority figure, but we question it. There's a famous saying that Alice Bailey uses at the front of all of her books that comes from the Buddha. And it basically is telling us that we need to question whatever it is that we see. And until we do that and make that knowledge true for ourselves, it's good to not pick on authority and just to pick on them. That's like a power game. But to question what we're learning and to practice it and see, like a scientific experiment, if that's really true for us in our own experience. A few more glamours, so you get the flavor of this. Isolation, the feeling that we're all alone in the world, that there's nobody out there to help us. That's usually due to an emotional trauma, fear, or the ego. We either separate ourselves off because we have to make ourselves superior to everybody else, or we're so traumatized emotionally that we're afraid to reach out. And that may be based in some real experience. We've been in a violent home or a violent society, and reaching out to others can cause us harm. But we've got to learn how to work through that so we can understand that we're really never alone. There are always, even on the inner realms, people and beings there to help us. I remember a time when I was a teenager and I felt so alone in the world, and I was outside crying because I felt so alone. And the interesting thing is, I had this breeze start to, how do I say this, caress my body. It wasn't just like a breeze blowing. It started to caress my body. And in a mystical kind of way, I suddenly woke up to the fact that I was forgetting who I was as the peaceful self. I was forgetting that there were inner realms, inner guidance. And as I started to rest in that and just trust that breeze caressing me, my mind opened up. And I began to see even practically who I could go to for help at that time in my life in terms of a physical person. The glamour of self-pity, which is the inability to see how one's suffering is connected to the suffering of others as well. I once remember a time in my life when I was sitting there and saying to myself, why me? Why am I having these things happen in my life? And I'd said that a number of times, but what was different about this time was that it suddenly occurred to me, why not me? Why do I expect myself to be exempt from the sorrows of the world? There's a wonderful Christian phrase about becoming open to the sorrows of the world and learning how to take that in. Take up your own cross. Become conscious of your own crucifixion, which is like allow your heart to break open, to borrow a phrase from the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, so that you too can open up to the sorrows of the world. Anything you suffer, other people are suffering. Become aware of that, and you get out of self-pity and you start to contact more the self. The glamour of individualism, which is kind of like isolation. It's an overemphasis on individual rights disconnected from the rights of the whole. We see that running rampant in Western society right now. And so even though there's so much prosperity in Western society going on now, there's tremendous depression, huge rates of suicide, because people feel so disconnected from each other. And in the studies on happiness, the number one reason for happiness is having loving human relationships around you. And individualism cuts us off from that. Psychism. Now, though psychic powers can exist, when they're a glamour, they're usually highly inaccurate and misunderstood. A lot of psychic readings, etc., you'd be just as well off flipping a coin and seeing whether it's going to be heads or tails. There's a lot of training that has to happen to really know if what you're perceiving psychically, clairvoyance, clear seeing, involves clear seeing. Are you really seeing clearly? Clairaudience, clear hearing. Clairsentience, clear sensing. Are you really getting this accurate? And overwhelmingly, very few psychics are willing to test themselves scientifically, rigorously. I've had the opportunity to do this in my life when I was able to sit down with some remote viewers who have been trying to train themselves in a scientific, accurate way. And it was fascinating because they take a picture and you don't get to see it. They're looking at it. And I myself was surprised how much of it I got right. I got a lot of the pieces of the picture right, but when it came to the conclusion, I got it wrong. So if you're really interested in developing our psychic sensitivity, we absolutely must, my personal opinion here, we absolutely must, may have a little too much emotional attachment to it, but I prefer, if I calm down a little bit, to have it really become something where we're scientifically trying to develop that psychism so it's not just a glamour. Glamour being busy, which is focusing more on breadth than depth, lacking a sense of perspective and priority. We just think we have to do. Amit Goswami, in his wonderful documentary, Quantum Activists, says we need to learn how to do. In other words, we need to learn how to be and then do. Be and then do. But when we're just busy, it becomes a glamour. So this, I hope, gives you a good understanding of all the work that has to be done in just this one sutra alone. If you want to start some of that work, you can go to the video I've created called Overcoming Glamour. And you're encouraged to practice that for at least 1 week while you're studying this sutra. And if you are going through this as a training, here's how you're encouraged to approach it. I'm also including information on who I am and how to reach me as well.